which is next.
Great.
Could you, the conference email that we're getting via survey, where is that coming from? The AOS, or is it coming from individual schools?
For parents, it supposed to be in newsletters. If not, I was gonna remind folks, it was supposed to go out in newsletters for individual schools. It might be on Chalk Talk for the high school, and then it went out to.
Where in Choctaw? It sometimes it's like if nothing's new, then it's the same thing from the last time. So I'm just wondering, that's why I asked which way it was coming out. Because it can be hard. Sometimes it's hard to find them if they're not sent out individually. If they're embedded in something else.
Yeah, I did it to the teachers. It went out through school messenger, and the parents, they were gonna, principals were gonna put it in the newsletters, but I could send it out to parents through school messenger as well.
Thanks.
There's no good question. Yes.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. The January note was about Schoology and the implementation. Our March PB day on the 17th is going to be Schoology all day, with teachers learning how to use that platform. And Julie and I will be going, she's already started with the high school and some middle school teachers, but going around to the different schools and having small group discussions with teachers so that they have a baseline knowledge going into that March PE day. One of the things that we wanted to highlight was that in Schoology, grades are done through a decaying average. So everything that a student does that is a body of evidence, or like an assessment, a project, quiz, test, those kinds of things will be counted. And the decaying average, the last thing that is submitted is worth 75%. So if you could say I'm a student in Julie's class and I submit an assessment, let's say, and she scores this particular standard, and let's say I get a 3. If there's just that one score, then that's 100%. That's how it goes. But let's say a month goes by, we're still learning about that standard, and the next time that I take an assessment on that standard, I'm gonna get 4. So the 3 is worth 25% and the 4 is worth 75%. So I'd end up with a 3.25 for that standard. And then if there happened to be, if it was a bigger standard, longer amount of time, if there ended up being another assessment, again, like the 3.25 would be worth 25% and the new score would be worth 75%. And so it wouldn't be a 3.75 or yes, 3.25. Oh, 3.75. Thank you. Yeah. I was just, I should have thought. You'd think a math teacher could have not a little bit better, but
Yeah, no, I think that's great because, then, the goal is to find out if people are learning the standard and it rewards them for continuing to material.
and it keeps what we had heard from students and parents and teachers was that, some of those earlier things may not have counted in the whole system. And we wanted to see some of those things get counted a little bit, but not take over. And so having the latest work count more really takes into account all of those concerns that people had in the old system. Carrie,
So is there a possibility, though, that a standard like that is going to be harmful to kids who don't necessarily excel at test taking? If a final exam is the last part of your standard and they struggle with test taking, but they're really good at the project related, or they're really active in class, and so they've been getting good scores based on their participation in class, but then they bomb the final. How is that going to be equitable for kids who learn differently and have different skills that they excel at.
Teachers always have that professional responsibility or professional judgment at the end. So if I know that a student had a bad day or doesn't do well on an assessment, I can take that into account as a professional and I can adjust if I need to. So that end score represents that student's learning. Maybe if I don't do well on the final exam, then Julie can have a conversation with me about it, right? And learn that, oh, she knows way more than what she really reflected on this written assessment. It doesn't necessarily have to be a written assessment. Maybe the end is a project. Maybe it's a debate. Maybe, there are a lot of different ways that we assess students.
And I guess I would just add that the last attempt is not high stakes
Right.
final midterm, like you're thinking about it in high school terms.
Mhm.
We're talking about multiple opportunities to practice and learn something. And our initial attempts, we didn't want to penalize kids for those, and we had a more pure system, but it was always incorporated into the grade calculation as an average. But the weighted average rewards the attempts over time. And then teachers always exercise judgment. So the kind of the calculation you'll see running as a parent will always up the last one, because all things being equal, you should be getting better at it, right? So we're assessing the same thing, and it shouldn't be assessments that look dramatically different, right? Because if I'm writing an essay, a thesis essay, and I've written 3 of them, by the 3rd time I should be getting better at it. It shouldn't be a fundamentally different type of product. So that's how we've been doing it anyways. It's a kind of consistent pattern of output. It's just a shift. And it's, some people are thrilled about it and some people like the more pure form.
Yeah.
So here we are, I just can't please everybody. But we did think that this was something that we kept hearing back from parents and students just about, these earlier attempts, people aren't working as hard and can we do something about that? So this was a concession to that.
I don't think, and you guys can correct me wrong here, I understand, I totally get what you're saying, but I don't think it's like, if I've been going along and getting 4s and then I got a 1 on the final exam, the teacher's not gonna say, well, that 1 is 75% of your grade. That, because the way it's like assessing by the standard, so it's like a little bit different than, at least that's my understanding from our.
Yeah, I have a kid who is an exceptional student, but has a tendency to bomb final exams, and that would be really rough for him. And he's not a student here, so it doesn't, but at the same time, I worry about kids who are in that same boat, so.
Yeah. Well, in terms of that, like the high school still does final evidence, but it's not the high stakes, traditional midterm final exam. It's your last chance to show that you've mastered this standard and to give your best evidence.
Yeah.
And
I do think it's
It's a
great
little
that
different, yeah.
you're addressing the issue of, kids not having to work as hard on those initial drafts. I brought that up, I think, from that
Sure,
side of it as well,
absolutely.
so.
Yeah.
I appreciate that you're working towards finding the best solution.
And our solution to our teachers who have said, wait a second, I want to have like the best, and it's, look, you're always using your discretion about where you think kids perform against a standard. It's just never supposed to work against them, right? We never grade lower. We always kind of grade for communication, and if you think this is representative of where they are, you let it stay. If you think there is a better way to communicate that, you have discretion. Always been that. Yeah. So, I think it was you, Carrie, last June, may have asked, where are we with senior X and graduation standards? Does that sound familiar?
If it wasn't me,
It was me.
it was one of us.
Sorry, I was speaking up. It was me.
And I know there's some new people on the board, so I'm just gonna give a little bit of background, so we're all on the same page. The high school for a very long time, had a senior exhibition. And it was really an opportunity for our seniors to explore an area of interest and do a reflective project where they basically picked something they wanted to learn, and then through that discovery process, reflected on what they learned about themselves as learners and how they're going to carry that forward into their next steps. And it was initially started with lots of funding, and there was a lot of money to support really cool projects. Over time, the money went away, but the projects still continued. And we had a long history of some really awesome events where people sort of had these amazing self-discoveries, and the community was involved, lots of mentoring. And not so great, but they were still soft skills nonetheless, and great experiences to kind of persevere through. And it's something our school has been very proud of. It's a very progressive thing to pull off a capstone like that. And whenever I've gone to public places, people say, "What are you doing?" and show us how you do it, and so forth. It's also a huge investment, right? It was like all hands on deck, school shuts down, everybody's there. And we make sure everybody, gets through it, for better, for worse, and maybe a little too much, hand holding through that process. But that's how important it was to our community and our school. And we did that because we didn't want to just have a diploma that was a bunch of credits, right? These are your grades, these are your credits, move on, have a nice day. It was really more about what the meaning behind the diploma for MBI was all about. And we wanted this experience to sort of say our kids are ready. 10 years ago, we also started a thing called proficiency-based education. And this was a list of constraints that the state put on us to say there are certain requirements you have to meet in terms of standards. And we went full force into it. And last spring, I gave you a report that showed we performed really well as a consequence. All of our data points went up. In fact, Jill did some additional data research to show that 2 years even after we started implementation, our college entry rates began to increase, particularly within main private schools. So we just saw a lot of great data coming forward. And those graduation standards and the way we were doing teaching and learning is now coming a little bit into question about, is that really the standards we should be, working with anymore? So we went with a pretty traditional way. These are the math standards you need to know. These are the English standards you need to know, and so on and so forth. But I'll tell you, there isn't one technology standard in there. There's nothing that we're certifying that talks about digital citizenship. We are moving at the speed of change that is so fast we can't keep up with it. And there's nothing about, being able to pivot. So we're starting to think about whether or not these standards are as relevant anymore too. So we did some kind of discussion about this pre-COVID. With Senior X, we went through a design thinking process to say, is this really the thing we want to, be fighting for anymore? And we got a lot of data that said yes. And we went through, again, design thinking, just so you know what that is. It's a problem solving process where you really put the, it's a human-centered problem solving process where you focus on the user, sort of the, if the user and Senior X is students, then the kind of next concentric circle would be teachers, then maybe parents, and then community members, employers, colleges, the state, school board. And you notice as you kind of come out in these concentric circles, the people who usually have most influence on the user is the outside in. And this is a problem solving process that tries to focus on the inside out and flip it a little bit. Excuse me. So we had some great response about how Senior X was working. And we wanted to make some adjustments though. So we built in things like the design thinking course, right, where they put on Healthy Trojans Day. It was more kind of community based. You could do it in teams as opposed to just the individual question and exploration. And then we made a bunch of other adjustments that sort of spoke to improving it. And then we were just about to start thinking about our graduation standards, and then COVID hit. So we suspended everything for 3 years, really. And in response to that question, I reached out to Jill and Matt and said, we got to figure this out, right? Where are we with this? So we met over the summer. There was a bunch of different teams at the high school kind of spearheading different initiatives. I took on the design team for Senior X, the graduation standard. So I'm working with 10 other teachers who signed up for this. They're passionate about it. And also at this time, we have what's happening with MeAsk, right? So everything's happening all at the same time. And NEASC is basically a process we're now a little excited about because it's changed its approach in ways to be a little more progressive and complementary to our belief system as a school. So one of the pieces of NEASC is being really clear on your vision of a graduate, what you want your graduate to look like, right? That's what Senior X is speaking to. That's what the graduation standards we're hoping to achieve. And now we have to go through this reflection process through NEASC and do a deep dive on it. Well, what is it we want to do? So we have started that process. And I went with this group and was looking for quick wins. I'll tell you that. I wanted to put some stuff in play because there's a lot of wonderful programming I don't want to lose. And they appropriately challenged me to say, this is the time to go deep and really go through that design thinking process like we did before, really step back and think about those concentric circles and what we're hoping to accomplish and design right. So that's where we are. And I know that's going to have something to do with this year's graduation standards requirements and Senior X, and probably looking for another suspension until we figure out what we want this to look like. That'll be procedural. I know Matt is going to have to bring this up into the high school meeting at some point, because that's written in our document somewhere, right? Is that correct, Matt? Yeah. So there's going to have to be a discussion about that. And we have to reevaluate our resources too. And what we can afford to, invest in as well. So that's one of the constraints we have to do a real reflective look on. So I wanted you to know that we were deeply thinking about it. We need to step back and do that deep dive. I know I'm talking too much, but I know that, the speed of change, I just want to share one more thing. I mean, everyone's heard about that AI thing, right? Where it writes essays for you. And I'm hearing that we need policies. And I'm like, we don't even understand it yet. So, as much as I'm up for a discussion, we're all learning about it so fast, and we're getting so much information that's saying, this is how it can be used really well. This is how we can, leverage it. So, before we can even begin to make decisions about it, we're in the learn stage. And that's where we are with the graduation standards and Senior X part. We're really stepping back and learning again. And I have a really great team in that process. Jill, I asked Jill and Matt to be here to talk a little bit about that too, particularly as it relates to NEASC and where they are with that. So Jill, I'm going to toss it over to you a little bit to talk about vision of a graduate.
Sure. When we look at what goes into and what kind of is guiding the vision of the graduate, we're really looking at it from the lens of understanding why do we do what we do, how do we do it, and what do we do. And when we have our why, our how, and our what, that end result should be the vision of a graduate. So we have our mission statement, which our learning area leaders have recently given us some feedback with, because it's a document that has not been re-examined since pre-COVID. So they've looked at it and said, does this really reflect where we are? We got some great feedback to support the district's service promise and our focus on equity. And we did some wordsmithing and fine tuning that is now resting with them. How do we do what we do? Well, that will be through our service promise and service value statement, which we are getting ready to revisit after some wonderful initial training in August, where all of the teachers at the high school brainstormed what could be our service promise and service values. So we're getting ready to finalize single drafts to contemplate and to reflect on. And what do we do is our high impact teaching instructional framework and professional framework. So why do we do it as our mission? How we do it will be the service promise and values we bring to our students, each other, in our community. And what we do is through the lens of our instructional models and who we are as professionals. When that all comes together, we'll have this vision of what students should know and be able to do when they receive that diploma. So in that process, Julie's design team is really investigating what do other, again, using a design thinking process, what do other schools include? Is it something where it's math has its standards and social studies and English?
Or is it more like the guiding principles? Is it a combination of it? Is it more on values? We're not sure yet. So we're looking and learning, and fine tuning our why, how, and what.
We're doing a lot of reading.
Can I ask, so I know you don't know it, but like in a concrete way, would you see the senior acts coming back like next year, or you don't have that kind of time?
I think it's not going to look like Senior X ever
Okay.
did. Yes, I mean, that was a very individual
Okay.
focused piece, and the leanings are about community driven pieces. You know, not what's good for me, but what's good for we type of shifts. So I think you won't see it like it used to be, but you might have an exhibition. It just might look, you know, it might have a different driving purpose. Yeah.
And then I just have one tiny
Yeah.
comment, because you brought up that. I hope we can view the, you know, the AI and the chat GPT stuff as a huge opportunity and resource, because I think it's just amazing. I mean, I've used it to like. I put some things into it that I've written and asked it to tell me what I said, and it gives you incredible feedback about whether what you were saying, you know, like. Made sense or didn't make sense, and shows you where if you're writing stuff. And so, I think, you know, it's just, I hope we're not reactionary about it, because like I've heard some schools, districts are, but I know won't do that because it's an amazing. Tool.
Well, I use that as an example just to show the types of
No, I know,
experiences our
I get
kids
it.
are gonna be
Yeah.
experiencing, and our minds are blown up like
Yeah.
once a week now, right?
Yeah. Marie,
I am wondering, thank you for all that, so I'm not trying to. I have a question that's related to what you do, but not about that.
Sure.
Do you anticipate that we will see some data about, I know there's stuff going on, assessments going on in January. Some of the data are like, this is where everybody is, these where all the schools are, these were the K-3, you know, how they're, who's in the quartiles, all that stuff. Do you anticipate us seeing that again anytime soon, especially related to what's the last couple of years?
Well, we always report out in the fall.
Is it the fall?
We did report out on this, right?
Did we?
Just doing a moment here. Yeah, so I think November is usually
Oh,
November,
okay.
December.
I need to miss
report
that
out.
meeting.
Oh, it's October. I think it's October. We get our data over the summer,
Okay,
and then we usually
Gotcha.
present early in the fall.
okay, I apologize.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
But it's probably in an old note and minutes too,
Okay.
so you can definitely take a look at it. And, you know, it is tricky because, you know, we are seeing good data in COVID, but it is hard to compare the pre, the net, you know, and then where we're heading to, because now it's so fundamentally different. So this is, we're struggling a little bit with the data points, but we will continue to report out, of course. Yeah.
And the winter testing for NWEA, we only test the students who score below the 50th percentile. We don't test everybody. Some schools or some teachers choose to test everybody because they want the data, but as a district, we don't require it. Yeah, Gail?
I guess I'm not entirely clear about whether or not your efforts to review the curriculum is focusing more on the gestalt of what you want a citizen who leaves the school to be able to do? Or is it also, for example, reviewing the science curriculum to determine whether or not kids are able to do computational work as opposed to sitting in a lab and doing or in addition to that? I'm just using that as a very small example. I mean, are you going through because you talked about things changing so fast, so
Absolutely.
what do you expect to see at the end of this process? In terms of how it impacts?
You mean in terms of content?
Yeah, for content.
Well, I will tell you, you mentioned science, so I'll just go back a little bit. Right before COVID too, we revamped science curriculum quite a bit. Standards being skill driven, and then allowing more voice and choice in terms of content. So for life and physical sciences, you didn't have to go through the prescribed, you need to take chemistry, but you could take physics, or you could also take astronomy. And continuing to build those different types of offerings to speak to interest, and also if I'm doing, you know, data analysis, regardless of my topic, the content shouldn't matter so much. So we've been on that journey for some time, focusing on skill. So I would say, I mean, content is always there, but it's not the primary focus. It's always skills, but what skills do we need in order to engage with that content? So, you know, a lot of our courses have really kind of moved towards this 4Cs approach. So if you've got kids, you might have heard them come home and talk about your communication skills, critical thinking skills, creativity, which is really about divergent thinking. And I always forget the 4th C.
Collaboration.
Thank you, collaboration, like, and being deliberate about teaching that and assessing it and being reflective about it. So, and not so much, you know, French Revolution, although one of my faves. I was so thrilled when my son asked me in his New York Times crossword puzzle, you know, I knew the answer, Marat-Zad. Sorry, that's pretty much all he's useful for is the New York Times crossword.
Harry?
I just want to go back to Senior X for a second and say, I totally trust in your process and that you'll come up with something amazing, but I do hope that the community aspect of bringing people in from the community remains part of whatever you do, because I know as someone who came in and judged many times before I had kids in the school here, it was always such an amazing opportunity to see what the kids were doing, and I was blown away by some of the presentations. Even the ones that were, you know, kind of like, all right, you know, this kid put less effort in than this one, they still, it was a leap that these kids had to take that I feel like just set them above your typical public school. And it was something that I was always proud to tell people back home and, you know, where I grew up and my friends about this amazing thing that our kids were doing at school. So I trust you'll do something, but please keep the community involved.
I appreciate that. It was a true celebration, and I know that our community has been constrained with COVID, right? And a lot of it is about how we're rebuilding our community connections too.
Yeah.
So.
Any other questions? Okay, moving on to, that's all are you guys done? Okay. Updates from subcommittees. I don't think we only have reorganization with a policy that, we have one policy we're gonna address, but other than that, there's no update. So the reorganization committee met, and we have an op-ed going in the paper on the why of reorganization this week, which was sent out to staff today so they could read it in advance of it appearing in the paper. And we were just, Mike and I were just digging in. We had a little bit of conflicting information about exactly the process of forming the RPC. So we're waiting for some guidance back from the attorneys about which interpretation was exactly right. So we can update on that and sort of begin that process once we have that information. I think our sort of focus, and Gail or Karen or Carrie or anyone can jump, or Mike can jump in if I'm missing something, is really on communicating why the reasons why this is so important right now. I think, you know, for a lot of us who are like deep in it, we know why this work is being undertaken. And Mike has a document that he's working on that hopefully can be shared that sort of lists more specifics to those reasons, you know, like we could say we want to advance equity, but people may not know what that means. And so sort of illuminating what the benefits and advantages for students, how it would lead to a better education for students, but also some of the other benefits. So that will be forthcoming. What else? What am I missing?
Jessica, can you define the RPC for people who aren't as
Oh, yes,
entrenched as
the
us?
reorganization planning committee, which is a state, the law requires that if you're going to change from an AOS to an RSU or anything like that, that you form that, and the state essentially defines the parameters of the makeup of that committee and a lot of the details of that committee. And then once that committee is formed, then that committee is the one who, you know, they would take our recommendations from that we created with the help of Rob Leo, but then they would be the deciders of
well, I mean, ultimately the voters are the deciders, but
Yeah.
they would be the deciders of what is brought to the voters. Any questions or comments? Okay, moving, and I think the op-ed went up to the board also.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
moving on to, our everyone's favorite agenda item, the calendar.
Well, part of the calendar considerations. And we spent some time with the A team speaking and with the team in the office and thinking about, what the work that we have been doing, over time. Last year, I kind of stepped in and the calendar was one of the first things that I had to bring forward and talk to you all about. So making small steps towards providing support for teachers for the type of work that they have to do with students today. And one of the things that we kind of couched our conversation in and what we have done as a team is remembering our service promise, which is, and it was shared earlier, that we're working to interrupt educational inequities and create schools in which every student thrives one conversation at a time. And you ask, well, how can a calendar support that? And I'll share some ways. But I also wanted to talk about the recognition that our calendar is also driven by our region. And so because we have a career and technical center by law, we have to make sure that we don't have more than 5 dissimilar days within those calendars. And the state actually sends us a letter after everybody sends in their calendars, and we as superintendents share our calendars and things get batted around to say that, okay, you meet the parameters and you can go forward. I don't know if I've ever, I'm new with this, so I haven't seen a letter to say, oh, you have to make changes, but it is part of the state law and some of the requirements around calendar creation. And so when you think about the calendars that we have developed over the last couple of years, we've been putting in some early release days in support of the work that teachers do. And that current support is around the work of MTSS, so the multi-tiered system of supports, which was RTI in the past, and sort of the moving forward of the high impact teaching and professional framework work that we're doing. This year in this calendar, we had 2 parts to those early releases. One was the early release for staff that was elementary based, so it was focused with the principals and their staffs and the goals that they're working on. And then we had a district-based one, and that work was designed around the coaching for equity and the art of coaching teams, where the idea is bringing together those vertical teams of what we had called in the past as common studies, and we still call them common studies, around those vertical teams, around specific areas of high impact teaching and focus. And as those teams started their work, they have asked for more time so that there could be more impact on what they're doing and what's in the classroom. So currently, our calendar has 3 days, 2 hours each that are district-based, that are spread throughout the calendar. And as I said, that was sort of that we started that to modeling on the art of coaching teams to develop that strong cohesion between our vertical teams across the schools. It was, sort of an exploration of practice, and that's what they're working on. Our elementary based were 4 days. Those again are 2 hours each. And then there's 2 extra days for parent teacher conferences within there. So there are 6 early release days within the current calendar. And that idea is to support multi-tiered system of support, which is we're working with the Great Schools Partnership on that coaching for each of the schools so that it's built within their schools and what they have for resources and support. Some of that work is, identifying and planning for student support, providing ed tech training. Example would be on some of those days, some schools have done some of the summit training on autism work in some of the schools. So supporting that, developing and integrating process monitoring tools, and working on school-based professional development. So that's the work that we're doing right now with those days that we have for early releases. The proposal that I want to share with you is to sort of strengthen that work is to move towards weekly early release on Fridays. It would be time dependent on transportation. It wouldn't be full. Right now, it's 2 hours. It would definitely be less than that, but I have to work with Matt and Eric and principals to see what would work to make it work so that that time is available to teachers. I think in any of the meetings that I have had and conversations with teachers and readings that I have done in terms of as we're moving forward, that importance of time is a necessary aspect of the work. And it's a little bit different. And I think when we talk in reorganization, we sort of talked about the different work that schools are doing and why reorganization for a variety of reasons. And that exists within the classroom and the needs and the things that teachers are having to do with kids. The proposal that I want to bring forward in February is that we would have a district-based early release one time a month. So that would be, there would be 9. And that again was requested by the teachers, and they've been doing their work. They feel to get more out of it, they need more of that time to be able to bring some of the fruits of that work into the classroom. For the elementary based, those remaining days, so you would go for 4 throughout the year to 21 throughout the year. Teaching is more complex today, and it's essential for us to respond to better support educators and students within the classroom by having this time to be able to support kids. We have a more diverse population. We want to make sure that we're providing timely and constructive feedback to students. And they're teaching and supporting social emotional skills as well, not only the content curriculum, and we're implementing new curriculum or revising curriculum. So there's tons of work that teachers are involved in. And right now they currently have some individual planning time and some team planning time. But in terms of what the needs that they're seeing, particularly in meeting each student's need, and I go back to our goal of making sure every kid thrives one conversation at a time, that takes some deep work and thought. And so I'm thinking this proposal sort of honors individual and common planning time, and that these 2 types of time are needed because currently teachers consistently have individual planning time, and more planning time with their colleagues is necessary to implement some of those best practices that they're exploring through the Great Schools Partnership now, and trying to make sure that the things that they figure out for progress monitoring and building student skills can happen, when they're in the classroom. And so, I think that that's sort of the next direction. And we had talked about sort of moving slowly towards that after meetings and taking a look at some of the information and listening to administrators and teachers. It's like, well, we're either going to do it or not. And so I'm presenting to do it. I have a model. I don't want to share it yet. I'm going to bring that to February. We sort of built it all, and I have a couple other models. But I wanted to share, what I'm looking for and what I'm looking for support for. And so I wanted some time just to be able to hear from you all. If you have some questions, I've done a little bit of work in taking a look at, in terms of, absences, what that looks like in terms of staff and how that looks in a month. And so, whether or not we see any trends or not. So I have some of that information. It's something that people are interested. And, to ask questions of myself and Julie and Rhonda, and there's some, principals here in terms of how we utilize that time.
Jessica asked.
Yeah, can you just be a little bit more clear? What exactly are you proposing for the elementary?
I am proposing an early release day every Friday.
Every Friday,
Every
early
Friday.
release date every Friday.
Potentially starting at dismissal at 1:30, but that's still a little squishy. That's going to take some conversations in terms of what that looks like.
Did you want feedback?
But I'm not there. We're not there yet on the time.
Jim? Or
Mike, I'm sure you remember, as I remember. Some of this work was done after school in the past. It appears none of it is done after school anymore.
Well, right now, the school day ends at 3:15, so that little bit of time doesn't really, help in terms of when you take a look at the contract and the working time for teachers.
Sorry, I.
I don't know, it's okay. Is it me then?
Yeah.
Oh, I think biggest concern, well, having two kids in there is the work week doesn't really accommodate that. And I understand the work that needs to be done in order to give our kids the best, but then I'm worried about the kids that aren't, like, school is their happy place, school is their safe place. What are we gonna do for those kids that don't have anywhere to go on those half-day Fridays? And there's a little, I'm not gonna be very supportive of a weekly half a day every Friday.
It wouldn't be a half a day, it would be even like an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah,
So it
yeah.
wouldn't be a half a day.
yeah,
Because-
I'm gonna be very upfront. I'm not gonna be supportive of that. I'll just.
Okay, I want to
Just to be very clear.
I also want to, it's not a half a day.
Okay, well, that
An
changes.
hour and probably 15 minutes in terms of,
1:30 to 3:15 an hour and 45.
Schools should get out at 3:15.
well, I was talking about the
The
contract.
contractual school day ends at 3, but kids get out at 3 or a little bit more, yeah.
And that would just be for the element, oh, sorry.
That would just, yes, sorry, just, yeah.
Is it okay if I, so there'd just be for the elementary kids, but the older kids who wouldn't necessarily need supervision,
Well, they already get out at 2:16.
so they already get out the hour early.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jared,
Will each school be able to provide like after school care to make up that hour, so parents can't get home in time off of work, because now you're gonna be limiting people's ability to order an income. Kind of a thing continually throughout the year.
That is something that we've talked about in previous years. If other folks who are on the board, Julie Meltzer did a survey, and that most parents were in favor. The majority of parents were in favor of something. There were caveats about providing support, particularly if it's a half a day or something like that. In terms of these shorter pieces, it's something that principals and we have sort of talked about, that being a possibility. Some schools have after-school programs, some do not, some don't. Is there something that we could do in between to support that? It's definitely a possibility, and it's on our radar to think about.
Jane,
I'm just wondering, like, so I think it was 2 years ago, we went to the current schedule, which has the early release once a month or whatever it is, and but that was a compromise based on what was suggested, which was less than what you're now proposing. And the feedback from the community was so voracious that the then superintendent stepped back from what he had proposed to what we have now. So I'm wondering what in your time over the last year in talking to the community makes you think that proposing something even beyond what was rejected by the community 2 years ago will now be accepted.
I think that data that we look, I think that data was the stuff that Julie created, and the majority of respondents did support an early release for teachers on a weekly basis. Well, like I said, as long as there were some things in place that supported kids for that extra hour or extra hour and 15 minutes. And that's something that we're thinking about. I think in the time between when I started and now, when I look at what our needs are and what our teachers are trying to do, and we've talked about how COVID has impacted our students and all the other things that teachers are expected to do. I think by providing this time allows them to do that work even better when they're standing in front of kids, that they will be more able to prepare kids for moving forward. And make sure that they're meeting the benchmarks that we're sort of setting for them.
Carrie,
So,
I mean, Marie, but sorry.
oh, well, I did have my hand up earlier.
No, I didn't see that.
So I am sure that the teachers would make good use of this time and can use it. But I am concerned about the equity situation with kids who, like Jessica said, don't have somewhere to go back. So I would need to see something that was showing that we were either doing something in the schools or we were working with our local, like Harbor House, Neighborhood House, community center type organizations to give kids someplace to go during that time, because we can't just send kids home to empty houses. And we can't keep people from working their jobs. It's hard enough, especially speaking as a single parent. The number of times when my kids were little that I had to leave work early, thank goodness I had a job that was flexible enough to let me leave when I needed to, but that's not the case with everyone. And, you know, not everybody has a parent who can be flexible. So.
Marie and
So I have some unrelated thoughts, so they're not necessarily connected, but. I do not remember any wholehearted support among community members. I'd love to see the survey data that you're recalling from Julie. And if, so, and I'd like to see the questions she asked and the raw data on that. Because my recollection is the opposite of that. Two, I can't even remember the last time our kids have had a full week of school, like even planned, let alone, you know, unplanned, let alone planning to not have a full week of school. And I know I'm just speaking from, you know, my perspective as a parent, but it's really hard to not half days, 2-hour days, early release days, whatever day you want to call it, that is not normal. I would love to see the data. I've asked for it before. I don't think I've gotten the real raw data on what that looks like. I've gotten like suppositions about what it is, but I can tell you
You mean about like learning, or sorry.
what's happening in those days.
Yeah.
What does the learning look like? I mean, our school days are so interrupted. And I realize that what I'm saying is actually like a really good reason for teachers to have more time. So I completely get that. What I'm saying is the antidote of the way to do that by taking kids out of school early, I really have a hard time with. I'm not saying that the time isn't needed, that teachers are not overworked. But if our solution to that is in the calendar versus in lots of other systematic changes that we need to make, I question that. Because pulling kids out of school early, like I literally can't remember the last time either of my kids were in school for a whole week. And I know that it's different when it's planned, but what happens on those days, I think, are really challenging, especially when you're having, you know, you might have 15 staff members out that day as it is. So as I said, I'm not really formulated all my thoughts on this, but I do want to challenge your assertion that that was widely accepted and that the data was. I'd love to see the raw data on that. And two, I acknowledge the problem, but I wonder about this being the solution. It's for all the reasons, the equity reasons with kids and the disruption, the continued disruption of any sort of stability in your week as a child.
You know,
Everyone's favorite topic, she said. Doesn't Ellsworth Elementary School have an every week?
Ellsworth, RSU 24, Union 93 schools, and I believe the Deer Isle donation schools. So all of our partner schools utilize an early release to support some of the teaching and learning that's happening within their schools.
I'm gonna call myself, and then I'll call them both. I'm at this point a little bit agnostic to it, but I think it would be helpful to see some clear data about like showing how does it improve teacher performance, or I know that's hard to think, or how does it change student performance for better or for worse. I mean, I think there's sort of like two separate issues here. One is what is it better or not better for kids, and like, do they get a better education with this? Like, that's something that I think would be helpful to know, like for the board in making this decision. Then I think a separate discussion, and sort of a separate arm, is this aftercare working parent piece. I mean, I think that realistically most jobs also don't end at 3. So, but I didn't realize we're adding an extra hour or whatever. So I think, that's those are two separate pieces that are both important, but they're separate pieces that we need to like have information about.
I was gonna bring up that if the teachers are taking some more time that's needed, that's what I'm hearing. Is there a possibility that we could offer something to the students that would also be that same opportunity to further themselves as a community activity, or possibly more music and arts in a already taxed sort of music arts in my opinion, curriculum. So I was just wondering if that could be an opportunity where, you could have a Samba school, or you could have some other kind of community thing that kids could not be, even if they had no skill in any of these focus areas, that they could get a taste of what that would be like. And if that was an hour and a half or whatever the time is, that maybe you could take that opportunity to tell them that this is their time to, have something that the teachers are needing. You need this too.
Okay, Jessica, then John, and then, there was Aaron and Jared.
I think a lot what I'm gonna say has probably already been said by Marie too, or myself beforehand, but I think. First, I'm gonna just acknowledge this conversation, like it's really exciting that we're doing this kind of work, because what we're acknowledging is the COVID burnout that our staff had talked to us about. Especially during COVID, we've had lots of really, especially at the Tremont board anyway, we've had lots of intense conversations about burnout and how like I can't keep sustaining this. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I'm glad we're moving it forward. I just have a hard time thinking that the right solution is to take our students out of the school, out of the classroom, because I mean, they've had really no, especially my little guy who's in second grade, he's had no consistency because COVID. He started kindergarten COVID, so he doesn't really know what like a full school week is really like. Like he's really missing out on that part of his education. So I think to go ahead and add like another half a day to their, or even a couple of hours off, is going to be a hardship, not just for the parents. It's going to be a hardship on the community, especially communities that don't have those centers that can provide a bigger group of people to get together. So I just,
John, and then Aaron, and then you have your hand up, Nisha, after Jared.
Well, yes, just first quick question, like when you're, I don't know, you probably don't know the answer to this, but like breaking it down hours wise, is it like, what is the difference between what we're doing now versus 1 hour every week? Is it how many hours? Before we're saying we're pulling the kids out of the classroom, let's look at what we're doing now and if there's any difference to what this does versus how much learning kind of missing. And then I think to maybe what Bo is saying, maybe one suggestion is maybe every teacher doesn't meet every Friday. Maybe you have a rotation of teachers where if certain kids can't get picked up by their parents, or that community aspect of it, you've got 5 teachers every Friday that host the gym here. You know what I mean? If you supervise play or something, so that those kids that can't go home for that hour can stay in school and they're supervised. They're not just kicked out. Just a suggestion.
Aaron, Jared, and Nisha.
That's what I'm interested in is that is this additional time, or are we taking time that are? We already have, we're still gonna have early dismissals interspersed as we do now, right? Or are we just shifting that time to a regular slot?
Well, the current early dismissals, we're trying to create a weekly experience for teachers to focus. So we still have the professional days that we have obligated. So those are full days.
Mm-hmm.
And so any of the half days we're adding on to those on a Friday. And
because we still have to fulfill the contract, the hours that they are spent with students, right? So
yep, that
that's set. And I think, I guess having it that time on a Friday is easier to plan if it was always that day, if it was always that time, you could adjust.
Yeah, it wouldn't be that you wouldn't have a Wednesday early release and it would always
Right.
be
That's
Friday.
what.
And then whatever a holiday is, that's going to be that, or whatever our plan. Those would just be where they are.
I would be in favor of that.
Possible to add up, like, and I think it's kind of what John was getting at, like what the number of hours is now versus what the number of hours would be with this hour, so an hour off every Friday, how those are fair.
My goal was to collect this.
Can I just add a little bit of the thought behind the weekly versus I think it's bi-monthly now, right?
Yes.
So there are kind of 2 monthly interrupted pieces. just an underlying tenet is this idea of just-in-time instruction, right? So you're putting your team together to respond in a timely manner to the kids in front of you. And the 2 weeks just create a little bit of a delay in that. So this is really, that's kind of the driving reason behind it, to get that group of people together in order to provide that just-in-time instruction, because you've got to look at data, you've got to deconstruct it, you've got to share what's working, not working, and every 2 weeks is just not as responsive.
Two questions. So if you're shortening that one day by an hour and a half, does that mean that you have to extend the school year to meet certain number of hours?
No, you're still meeting it's 5 instructional hours, but you don't have the extended.
And then it's kind of like a crazy idea, but is it possible that for like any scheduling where there's the last 40 years of my life, I've known that the 2 days before Thanksgiving, you have to come to school those 2 days and then you have off. Is it possible to switch those to professional development days? And then this kids have off for one whole week and families go on another week on vacation.
Those professional days are contracted, so if you you can provide, I mean, there are probably models where you can provide more professional time, but then you have to compensate for those days. That have to change the contractual situation.
Misha and Gail.
Yeah, I share the thoughts that people have shared already about the need for this time, but also the concerns about not enough school and like feeling like it's been so disjointed that between the professional days and the holidays and the early release days, it's like just like not getting into a rhythm. However, the one thing that does kind of like intrigue me about this proposal is that consistency is so helpful. I do feel like consistency is really helpful for the kids. I think it's helpful for the parents too. Like people will be texting each other because they just realized halfway through the week that it's an early release day on Friday. It seems kind of unpredictable. So I guess there is something about what you're talking about just having the same schedule every week. That seems like it could be good for kids and families.
It just seems to me that so much of what happens now in schools, from whatever I can glimpse from my position, is much more team oriented than it ever used to be. And I don't know how many of you have spent time in a hospital, but you should be reassured that if you end up like an MDI hospital, that the team in the morning, every morning before they start making their rounds individually and taking care of people, they huddle. It's called a huddle. And I think they do that in some of the outpatient clinics too. Who's coming in? What are the issues? How are they going to approach that as a team to respond to that person's problems? And I see this effort, perhaps, you can correct me if I'm wrong, as somewhat analogous to that. And you're going to hopefully get better care rather than just the heroic single doctor going into your room to take care of you, or the heroic teacher individually trying to meet all of that classroom's needs. So if that's some of what happens as a result of this in real time, then I think we should be open to considering that that's how work, particularly human services kind of work, is changing, and hopefully for the better.
Harry and then Clifford, and then I think we can take 2 more after that, and we should wrap it up.
So one of the things that I'm hearing a lot of is that we're talking about a rhythm, and I agree with what Misha's saying, in that we can set a rhythm. That doesn't mean that every kid goes to school from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. every day. That's the rhythm of a week as opposed to a rhythm of a day. And I know our teachers can adjust that so that the kids are getting the kind of support and the kind of learning time that they need. And if we think about it from this is an opportunity for our kids as opposed to a detriment to our kids, something like what Bo's saying, where we look at having arts programming or something like that in that window, I think it could be a huge positive to our kids. The question is, do we have the resources, and is there funding that would need to happen in order to have some kind of a regular arts programming during that time, or regular supervised play like John's talking about. So, rather than, I think there's there's that fear that people hear, oh, my kid's gonna get less, whereas I think as long as we're providing a safe place for the kids to be, that we can actually look at this as an opportunity to do more for our kids. The question is, do we have the resources to do that? And my question is, are we currently offering anything for our kids in the half days that we have in the calendar right now? Or is that just the parents are expected to figure out what to do on those early release days?
Parents come pick up on those.
Yeah. So, yeah, okay.
I just thinking that, I know like Harbor House, for example. They have a limit sometimes on how many children they can hold in one of those rooms, depending on how young they are. Like the after school kids can pretty much go over there and roam free and do what they want, but the younger kids, there's limits. And it does stress out the Harbor House staff a little bit when they get a lot more kids all of a sudden. Like during the COVID, there was a lot of kids in Harbor House because they couldn't be in the school. So I mean, but it gave them a place to go, but I think there are limits on the numbers. So I'm sure neighborhood house would be the same as far as how many kids they can safely, by state law, have.
Marie and then.
All sort of unrelated, but I will acknowledge that there's been talk about, we've talked about the inequities of planning time and common studies time between the high school with the starting late and the elementary school for years since that change went forth. We've also talked, and Matt himself said that late start day is not what he wants, but we're kind of stuck into it, and we, because of the bus situation we're in. And we're really not able to move right now, at least, we don't have the resources to get the kids at the high school, in the high school at the time he and all you folks really want them there, because now we're a slave to, we're burdened by where we are, very luckily with our fantastic bus drivers, but with that system that is always on the brink of falling apart. I think, so there's the planning time, the equity that we are trying to match, and I can see how this calendar does that for the elementary school teachers. I guess I feel as though, again, I'll reiterate, I see the problem. I wonder if there are other ways that you could put forth to solve it other than early releases every week for all the reasons that were already mentioned. I know there's differences in the schools in terms of how many sizing and staffing and things like that, and scheduling is always an issue. We don't want to decrease any of our programming, but are there scheduling things that can be done at the elementary schools and the different elementary schools to meet that need for common studies for the elementary school teachers, to bring them up to the same level of common studies time that the high school teachers have? Are there other ways that we can meet all the teachers and the students and the community's needs? Because we heard very much loud and clear that this, granted it was in the middle of when we didn't have kids in school at all, but it was like, please don't give us a calendar that shows our kids not in school, because it's not just about learning time. It's about time to be with friends. It's about time to socialize. It's about time to learn how to regulate your emotions, about working with, new people. It's like learning how to flirt. It's like all these things that you do when you're a kid. And the less time they're in a safe place where they're getting fed and they've got eyes on them and they're, then, and I do wonder if we could ever go back. How would we ever go back from this? And I'm not saying maybe we should if we do this, but I'm just saying, I feel like I see the problem, I understand it, and heard the problem, especially with the inequities between the times in the high school and the elementary school. I would just ask if this is the only way, or if there are other creative ways that meet the needs of everybody who would be affected by this.
So I think Mike has his marching orders. Our thought and research and informational pieces that we can bring back to us for the next meeting, where we'll dig into this calendar more.
Probably trickle little bits of information, like the data piece. I'll make sure, because there's some things that already exist that I can sort of share and get to people so you can see it. So it's a flood of information in February that you actually look at. So.
Okay, That brings us to our action item, which is second reading and approval of revisions to policy and JEA compulsory school attendance. And we can have a, motion.
So move approval of policy JEA compulsory school attendance as revised.
Second. Discussion? You want to, is there anything to explain about it? We don't- no.
Okay, I thought that the last time was just-
Okay, any more discussion? Okay, all in favor? All opposed? Okay, so that brings us on to, other business, any other business? Marie?
I wanted to, on the tails of the policy committee, there's a lot of new folks. I just wanted to put this out there, and if I'm saying anything that's not correct, please correct me. The policy committee is an open committee. You don't have to be anything other than sitting at this table to join at any time, anytime there is a meeting. That's what the spiel I got when I joined. And so what I've done is like, anytime I get in there and I see, oh, this is like a policy that I feel like I could maybe, I have something to offer, or I care deeply about it, or I remember something that might be helpful, I click on that meeting and I join. I did that a couple times and now I'm always on it, which is fine, but this is a committee that is really benefits from diverse opinions and experiences. And I know just from looking around that we've got a lot of people who do things in their professional life or in their, in extracurricular things that would be really important for a lot of these policies to work on. It's one of the most important committees that we do, because at the end of the day, it's like the only thing we really do is policies. So please click on those and like read them and see what they're about and bring your expertise. Even if it's just like, oh, I can only do it this month, and then you can't, but it's not a standing committee. It's 100% open all the time. And there needs to be more voices and brains, in my opinion.
Next meeting is the 26th.
Mark your calendars, 26th.
Okay, future agenda items. I foresee the calendar on our future agenda item.
Yep.
And we will have also our regular updates and so forth. And our regular superintendent, all that stuff, and probably some policies. But so if there's anything else. Yeah,
Can I just say that the annual public budget meeting should not be optional attendance for board members? That we really should all come to that meeting, because sometimes you get pretty thin attendance from the board. You get pretty thin attendance anyway. Yes. And we need to have people voting on it, so please do what you can, bring others with you.
so is there any public comment? Okay, our next meeting is Thursday, 19th of January, the annual public budget meeting. Be there.
There's no agenda. We don't expect anything to come into your mailbox.
Sometimes people haven't come because they didn't, get an agenda like they usually get, so they kind of like off their radar. So now this is the reminder that you will get. So that was the moment to mark your calendar.
Just
Mark
your
yes, and our next regular meeting is Monday, the 13th of February.
What time is the annual meeting start?
Starts at 6 o'clock. It will be here in the library. I want it to be cozy. I feel like there's.
What time?
That's a great question. Let's ask. Wait, what time is the policy meeting usually?
5:30.
Okay.
5:30.
Anybody second? Is there a second? All in favor? Get up. Yeah.